The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and dying sunlight, and Lieutenant Ren Castellanos stepped onto foreign soil with the weight of her equipment and the heavier weight of what she already knew was coming. The forward operating bays sprawled across the valley floor like a wound in the earth, all concrete barriers and razor wire, and men who turned to watch her approach with expressions she had memorized years ago. Curiosity, dismissal, the particular kind of contempt that lived in the space between a glance and a turned shoulder. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state or country you are watching from tonight. Maybe you know someone in the military who has faced similar challenges, or perhaps you have served yourself. We would love to hear from you. She walked toward the operations building with her bag slung across her back, her boots finding solid ground with each step while the rotor wash settled behind her. The sun was bleeding out across the western ridge, painting everything in shades of amber and rust, and somewhere in the compound a generator hummed its endless mechanical prayer. Ren had arrived at dozens of bases just like this one. She knew the rhythm of these places, the unspoken hierarchies, the way conversations died when certain people entered certain rooms. The briefing room was already full when she pushed through the door. 12 operators sat around a scarred wooden table covered in maps and satellite imagery, and every single one of them looked up when she entered. Master Chief Gareth Holloway stood at the head of the table with a pointer in his hand and irritation already settling into the lines of his face. He was broad across the shoulders, gray at the temples, and carried himself with the particular authority of a man who had never been required to question his own assumptions. "You must be the attachment," he said without offering his hand. "Find a seat in the back." Ren did not respond. She moved to the rear of the room and settled into a metal folding chair that creaked beneath her weight, and she began studying the maps on the table from a distance while the other operators returned their attention to Holloway. She recognized the terrain immediately. Mountain passes. Scatel de Village. A compound circled in red marker that sat in a valley with only 2 viable approach routes, both of them perfect for ambush. Staff Sergeant Declan Voss leaned toward the man beside him and spoke in a voice that was clearly meant to carry. "Diversity higher," he said. "Pentagon probably threatened to cut funding if they did not send us a female operator." The man beside him chuckled. Voss was lean and wiry with a shaved head and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He glanced back at Ren to make sure she had heard, and when their eyes met, he held her gaze with deliberate challenge. Ren looked away first, not because she was intimidated, but because she had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting in the moment. Her father had taught her that in the swamps outside Miami when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle. "Patience, Mija," he would whisper in the darkness while they waited for prey that did not know it was being hunted. "The darkness rewards those who wait." Holloway continued the briefing. "High-value target," he said, tapping the circle compound. "Confirmed location for the next 48 hours only. We insert at 0200. Move through the northern pass, secure the target, and extract before sunrise." He looked around the room at his team. "Questions?" Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Al-Rashid spoke from his position near the window. He was older than most of the operators, with a neatly trimmed beard and the quiet intensity of a man who spent his life analyzing information that determined whether people lived or died. "What is Lieutenant Castellanos assigned to?" he asked. Holloway barely glanced in her direction. "Rear security," he said. "She can watch our backs while we handle the objective." Al-Rashid shook his head slowly. "I requested her specifically for this operation, Master Chief. Her night operations qualifications are exceptional. She should be on point." The room went silent. Voss laughed openly, and several others exchanged glances that communicated everything they thought about that suggestion without requiring words. Holloway set down his pointer and crossed his arms over his chest. "With all due respect to intelligence," he said, "I have run night operations in terrain like this for 15 years. I will decide who takes point, and it will not be someone whose primary qualification is checking a box on some admiral's diversity report." Ren remained perfectly still in her chair. Her hands rested on her thighs, and her breathing stayed, even, and her face revealed nothing of what moved beneath the surface. She had heard variations of these words more times than she could count. They had followed her through BUD/S training, through her first deployment, through every operation where she had proven herself only to arrive at the next one and start from zero again. Al-Rashid caught her eye from across the room. His expression carried something that might have been apology or might have been a promise. She understood what he was telling her without words. Be ready. Your moment will come. The briefing continued for another hour while the sun finished dying outside the window and darkness claimed the valley. Rin listened to every word, memorized every detail, and traced the approach routes on the maps with her eyes while planning alternatives that no one had asked her opinion about. She noted the choke points where an ambush would be most effective. She calculated the sight lines from the surrounding ridges. She identified 3 separate locations where enemy forces could position themselves to cut off retreat. When the briefing ended, the operators filed out in small groups, and Rin found herself alone in the room with only the maps and the shadows for company. She stood and walked to the table, running her fingers across the topographical lines that represented the mountains where they would be fighting in a few hours. Her father had died in mountains not so different from these. A reconnaissance mission that went wrong in ways that were still classified, a body that was never recovered, a flag that her mother kept folded in a drawer because looking at it hurt too much. Rin had joined the Navy 3 months after his memorial service. She had clawed her way through training that broke most of the men who attempted it. She had earned her trident in blood and sweat and silence. And still she stood in rooms full of men who looked at her and saw nothing but a box that needed checking. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Al-Rashid standing in the doorway. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I have read your classified file," he said quietly. "I know what you are capable of, Lieutenant. Tonight may require exactly those capabilities." Rin nodded once. She did not need reassurance, but she appreciated that someone in this compound understood what she brought to the mission. "What are you expecting?" she asked. Al-Rashid glanced toward the door to make sure they were alone. "Intelligence suggests the enemy knows we are coming," he said. "This operation may not go according to plan." Rin looked back at the map, at the mountain passes and the circled compound, and all the places where death could be waiting in the darkness. "Then it is a good thing I do my best work when plans fall apart," she said. She gathered her equipment and walked out into the night to prepare for whatever was coming. The helicopters lifted off at 0200 with their running lights extinguished and their rotors cutting through air that had turned cold with the absence of the sun. Rin sat in the rear of the lead bird with her back against the vibrating metal wall and her rifle across her knees, watching the other operators through the dim red glow of the cabin lights. No one spoke to her. No one acknowledged her presence. She had become a ghost before the mission even began. The mountains rose up beneath them like the bones of some ancient creature pushing through the skin of the earth. Rin studied the terrain through the open door, tracking ridgelines and valleys, memorizing the shape of shadows against the stars. Her father had taught her to read landscape the way other people read books. Every fold in the earth told story. Every shadow held a secret. The darkness was not emptiness, but presence, a living thing that would reveal its truths to anyone patient enough to listen. Holloway's voice crackled through her earpiece. 90 seconds to insertion. Remember your assignments. Stay tight and stay quiet. The helicopter flared and settled onto a rocky outcropping, and the operators spilled out into the night with practiced efficiency. Rin moved with them, her boots finding purchase on loose stone while her eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness away from the cabin lights. The air smelled of dust and dried vegetation and something else beneath it, something that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. She knew that smell. It was the scent of a place where violence was waiting to happen. The team formed up and began moving through the northern pass in a loose column with Holloway on point and Rin relegated to the rear as promised. She watched the operators ahead of her navigate the terrain with competence, but not mastery. Their movements efficient, but loud to ears that had been trained to hear what others missed. A kicked stone here, a scraped boot there. small sounds that carried far in the mountain silence. Rin moved differently. She placed each foot with deliberate care, shifting her weight in ways that left no trace and made no sound. She had learned to walk like this in the Everglades, stalking through cypress stands and sawgrass marshes where a single misplaced step could send prey scattering into the darkness. Her father had made a game of it when she was young. "See if you can get close enough to touch me before I hear you, Mija." She had failed 100 times before she succeeded, and by then the silence had become part of her bones. Petty Officer Tobias Okonkwo glanced back at her as they moved through a narrow defile between two rock formations. He was the demolitions expert, a compact man with careful hands and eyes that missed very little. Unlike the others, he did not look at her with contempt. His expression was simply curious, as if he was waiting to see what she would do when the moment came. The column halted at Holloway's signal, and Rin watched him consult with Voss near the front of the formation. They were studying the terrain ahead, the final approach to the compound that sat in the valley below. From her position, she could see what they were looking at, and she could also see what they were missing. The ridgeline to the east had too many shadows. Not the natural shadows of rock and scrub brush, but the kind of shadows that moved when the wind did not. She keyed her radio and spoke quietly. "Overwatch. Possible contacts on the eastern ridge. Recommend we hold position and reassess." Voss responded before Holloway could. "Rear security does not make tactical calls. Stay off the comms unless you have something useful to report." Rin bit back the response that rose in her throat. She had something useful to report. She had just reported it. But the channel went silent, and the column began moving again, descending toward the valley floor with the eastern ridge looming above them like a threat they refused to acknowledge. She watched those shadows as they moved. One of them shifted position, tracking the column's progress. Another raised something to its face that might have been binoculars or might have been a rifle scope. The enemy was up there. She was certain of it now. They were walking into a kill zone, and no one with the authority to stop it was willing to listen. The compound came into view as they rounded a final bend in the trail. It was larger than the satellite imagery had suggested, a sprawling collection of buildings surrounded by a low wall that would provide minimal cover if things went wrong. Holloway signaled for the team to spread out into assault positions, and Rin found herself pushed even further back, positioned behind a boulder that gave her a view of nothing but the backs of her teammates. She did not stay there. Moving with the silence that had become her birthright, she repositioned herself to a rocky outcropping that gave her sight lines in 3 directions. The eastern ridge, the compound, the trail they had used to approach. If the ambush came, and she was now certain that it would, she would see it before anyone else. The assault element began their approach to the compound wall. Rin watched them move through her rifle scope, tracking their progress while splitting her attention between them and the ridge above. The shadows up there had multiplied. She counted at least 6 distinct positions now, all of them oriented toward the kill zone below. She keyed her radio one more time. "Contact imminent. Eastern ridge. 6+ hostiles in overwatch positions. Recommend immediate withdrawal." Holloway's response was immediate and sharp. "I said stay off the comms, Lieutenant. One more transmission, and I will have you removed from this operation." Rin lowered her hand from the radio. She had done what she could within the chain of command. She had followed protocol and reported her observations and been dismissed by men who could not see past their own assumptions. What happened next would not be her fault, but it would be her responsibility to survive it and to save as many of her teammates as she could. The first explosion lit up the night like a second sun, and the world came apart in fire and thunder and screaming. The explosion ripped through the assault element with savage precision, sending bodies tumbling across the rocky ground like discarded toys. Rin was already moving before the echo faded, her training taking over while her mind processed the chaos unfolding below. Muzzle flashes erupted from the eastern ridge in a coordinated pattern that spoke of careful planning and patient waiting. The enemy had known they were coming. They had prepared the kill zone and baited the trap, and now they were executing their ambush with brutal efficiency. She heard screaming over the radio. voices overlapping in panic and pain and desperate calls for support that would not arrive in time. Holloway was down. She saw him lying motionless near the compound wall, his body crumpled in a way that suggested he would not be getting up again. Voss was screaming commands that contradicted themselves, ordering retreat and advance, and covering fire all in the same breath, while rounds snapped past his head and kicked up dust at his feet. Ren moved through the chaos like water through stone, finding the paths that others could not see. She reached two wounded operators pinned behind a shallow depression in the ground, their blood black in the starlight as it pooled beneath them. Corporal Nadia Petrov was one of them, the communications specialist clutching a wound in her shoulder while she tried to raise anyone on the radio with her free hand. Comms are jammed, Petrov gasped when she saw Ren sliding in beside her. They have got us boxed in. I cannot reach anyone. Ren took stock of the situation in the space of 3 heartbeats. The ridge above was pouring fire down on their position. The compound ahead had come alive with additional hostiles who were now flanking from the west. The trail behind them was certainly compromised. They were surrounded and outnumbered, and their command structure had collapsed in the first 30 seconds of contact. She grabbed Petrov by her uninjured arm and began dragging her toward a cluster of boulders that offered better cover. The other wounded operator, a young sergeant whose name she had not learned, followed on his belly with his rifle clutched against his chest. Rounds impacted the ground around them, throwing up sprays of dirt and rock fragments, but Ren did not stop moving until all 3 of them were behind solid stone. "Stay here," she told Petrov. "Keep pressure on that wound, and do not move until I come back for you." "Where are you going?" Petrov asked, her eyes wide with pain and fear. Ren did not answer. She was already gone, slipping back into the darkness toward the main body of the team, where the fighting was heaviest. She found Okonkwo crouched behind a low wall, methodically returning fire toward the ridge while blood ran down his face from a gash above his eye. "Holloway is down," he said when she appeared beside him. "Voss is losing it. We need to consolidate, or we are all dead." Ren nodded. "Where are the others?" Okonkwo pointed toward 3 separate positions scattered across the approach to the compound. "Scattered. At least 2 more wounded that I know of. Maybe more." He looked at her with something new in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You were right about the ridge. You tried to warn us. That does not matter now," Ren said. "What matters is getting everyone out alive." She assessed the enemy positions again, tracking muzzle flashes and calculating angles of fire. The hostiles on the ridge had the high ground and superior numbers, but they were spread thin trying to cover the entire valley. The flanking element from the compound was more immediate but also more exposed. If someone could neutralize the heavy weapons position on the ridge, the team might have a chance to consolidate and establish a defensive perimeter until extraction could reach them. Voss stumbled into their position, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked at Ren as if seeing her for the first time. "We're done," he said. "We need to call for emergency extraction. We need to get out of here." "Extraction cannot reach us until dawn," Ren said. "That is 5 hours away. We have to survive until then." "How?" Voss demanded. "They have us pinned from every direction. Holloway is gone. Half the team is scattered. How exactly do you propose we survive 5 hours of this?" Ren looked out at the darkness beyond their position, at the muzzle flashes on the ridge and the shadows moving through the compound. She listened to the rhythm of the gunfire, the cadence of the enemy communications she could hear faintly on the captured frequencies. She felt the night pressing in around them, vast and deep and full of secrets that only she knew how to read. "Someone has to go out there," she said quietly. "Someone has to take the fight to them." Voss laughed bitterly. "That is suicide. No one can operate alone in that terrain against those numbers." Ren turned to look at him, and something in her expression made him step back. "You are wrong," she said. "The darkness is not your enemy tonight. It is theirs." She checked her rifle, verified her ammunition count, and secured her knife against her thigh. Okonkwo watched her preparations with growing understanding. "You're going to hunt them," he said. It was not a question. Ren did not respond. She simply met his eyes for a long moment, and then she turned and walked toward the edge of their cover. The night swallowed her whole, and within seconds she had vanished so completely that Okonkwo found himself wondering if she had ever been there at all. The darkness had claimed its own. The team lay scattered across the valley floor like broken pieces of a puzzle that would never fit together again. Ren moved through the shadows at the edge of the kill zone, cataloging positions and counting survivors while the gunfire continued in sporadic bursts. She identified 3 distinct clusters of American operators pinned in separate locations. Okonkwo and Voss held the position near the low wall. Petrov and the wounded sergeant remained behind the boulder cluster to the south. A third group of 4 operators had taken cover in a shallow ravine near the compound entrance, trading fire with hostiles who had them flanked on 2 sides. 5 hours until dawn. 5 hours until extraction could reach them. An eternity measured in ammunition and blood. She pressed herself against a rock formation and listened to the night. The enemy was communicating over radio, their voices sharp with excitement and confidence. They believed they had won. They believed it was only a matter of time before they finished what they had started. Ren understood enough of the language to piece together their tactical picture. 5 primary hunters had been dispatched to locate and eliminate any Americans who had scattered beyond the main kill zone. Additional forces held the high ground on the ridge. A command element remained in the compound, coordinating the operation. The hunters were her first priority. They would be moving through the darkness right now, searching for wounded operators to finish off. If she could eliminate them before they found their prey, she could buy the team precious time. She closed her eyes and let her other senses expand into the darkness. The smell of cordite and dust. The distant sound of boots scraping against stone. The particular quality of silence that meant someone was trying very hard not to be heard. Her father had called it listening with your whole body, a skill he had learned from his own father in the mountains of Cuba before the revolution changed everything. There, movement to the northeast, approximately 40 meters. 2 shapes picking their way through a boulder field, their silhouettes occasionally visible against the star-scattered sky. They moved with confidence, with the arrogance of men who believed they owned the night. They had no idea that something far more dangerous than them was watching from the shadows. Ren began her approach. She moved the way water moves through cracks in stone, flowing around obstacles rather than confronting them directly. Each step was placed with absolute precision, her weight shifting in patterns that produced no sound and left no trace. The Everglades had taught her this. The Navy had refined it. But the foundation had been laid in childhood, in those long nights when her father would disappear into the swamp and challenge her to find him before sunrise. 20 meters. She could hear them breathing now, could smell the tobacco one of them had smoked before the mission. They were speaking quietly to each other, joking about the Americans they had trapped, speculating about how long it would take to finish them all. One of them laughed at something the other said. 10 meters. She drew her knife from its sheath. The blade blackened to prevent reflection. Her rifle would be faster, but the sound would alert every hostile in the valley. This had to be silent. This had to be absolute. 5 meters. The lead hunter stopped suddenly, his head turning as if he had sensed something wrong. His companion bumped into him from behind and cursed quietly. "What is it?" he asked. The lead hunter did not answer. He was staring into the darkness directly at the spot where Ren crouched motionless behind a jagged outcropping. His hand moved toward his weapon. He never completed the motion. Ren covered the final distance in a single fluid movement, her knife finding its mark with the precision of 10,000 hours of training. The lead hunter dropped without a sound. His companion had half a second to register what was happening before she was on him as well, her blade silencing his attempt to cry out. 2 down, 3 hunters remaining. She searched the bodies quickly, recovering ammunition and a radio that would let her monitor enemy communications directly. The radio chattered with updates from the other hunting teams, their positions and progress reports painting a picture of the battlefield that only she could see. One team was moving toward the ravine where 4 Americans were pinned. Another was circling south toward Petrov and the wounded sergeant. The third was holding position on the ridge, providing overwatch for the others. Rin marked the location of her kills with a small arrangement of stones, 3 rocks stacked in a pattern her father had taught her. It was an old habit, a way of honoring the hunt even when the prey was human. She did not enjoy killing, but she understood its necessity, and she refused to pretend that the men she killed were anything less than men. The radio crackled again. Team 2, report position. Silence. Team 2, acknowledge. More silence. Rin permitted herself a small smile. They would realize soon that their hunters had become the hunted. Fear would begin to spread through their ranks like poison through water. And fear made men careless. She checked her ammunition, adjusted her equipment, and oriented herself toward the next target. The team moving toward Petrov was closest. If they reached her position before Rin could intercept them, the wounded communications specialist would die. That was not going to happen. Rin melted back into the darkness and began to move. The southern approach to Petrov's position was a maze of broken rock and stunted vegetation, the kind of terrain that swallowed sound and hid movement from all but the most trained observers. Rin navigated it like she had been born there, her body remembering pathways that her eyes could barely see. The captured radio fed her a constant stream of enemy communications, and she tracked the hunting team's progress through their own words. Moving through Sector 7, one of them reported. No contact yet. Continuing south. They were close. Maybe 200 meters from where Petrov lay bleeding behind her cluster of boulders. Rin pushed herself faster, sacrificing some of her silence for speed. The balance between stealth and urgency was a calculation she made with every step, weighing the risk of detection against the cost of arriving too late. She reached a ridgeline that overlooked the hunter's approach route and settled into a prone position among the rocks. Through her rifle scope, she could see them now, 2 figures moving with the careful confidence of experienced fighters. They communicated through hand signals, leapfrogging from cover to cover as they closed on their target. Professional, disciplined, dangerous, but they were looking in the wrong direction. Rin controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow to the steady rhythm that preceded every shot she had ever taken. Her father had taught her to shoot before she could ride a bicycle, standing her on a wooden crate so she could reach the rifle rest he had built in their backyard. Squeeze the trigger like you were keeping a secret, he would tell her. Gentle, patient, let the shot surprise you. The lead hunter paused at the edge of a clearing, scanning the terrain ahead. His partner moved up beside him, and for a single moment they stood together in a pool of starlight that painted them silver against the darkness. Rin squeezed the trigger. The first hunter dropped before the sound of the shot reached his companion. The second man spun toward the source of the fire, his weapon coming up, his mouth opening to shout a warning. Rin's second shot caught him in the chest, and he crumpled beside his partner without making a sound. She waited, listening, counting heartbeats. The echo of her shots faded into the mountain silence, and nothing moved in response. No shouts of alarm. No rushing footsteps. The rest of the enemy force had not pinpointed her position. 3 down, 2 hunters remaining. She descended from the ridgeline and approached the bodies to confirm her kills. The captured radio was already buzzing with confused chatter. Team 3 is not responding. Last position was Sector 7. Someone checked their location. Rin collected what ammunition she could carry and arranged her stones beside the fallen hunters. 3 rocks stacked in a small cairn that no one else would understand. A private ritual, a way of acknowledging that these had been men with lives and histories and people who would mourn them. War demanded their deaths, but it did not require her to pretend they were nothing. She keyed her own radio, the American frequency that connected her to whatever remained of her team. Okonkwo, this is Castellanos. Sector 7 is clear. Petrov's position is secure for now. What is your status? The response came through static and interference. Castellanos, where the hell are you? We heard shots to the south. Voss wants to know what is happening out there. Tell Voss to focus on holding his position, Rin replied. I am handling the hunters. Keep everyone consolidated and stay off the skyline. I will check in when I can. She did not wait for acknowledgement. Time was her enemy now almost as much as the hostile forces arrayed against her team. Every minute she spent talking was a minute the remaining hunters could use to locate more of her scattered teammates. The radio chatter from the enemy frequency had shifted in tone. The confidence she had heard earlier was giving way to something else. Uncertainty, concern. The hunters had become aware that they were no longer the only predators in the darkness. Team 1 pulled back to the compound, a commanding voice ordered. Team 4, hold position on the ridge and report any movement. Something is out there. Someone is hunting our hunters. Ren smiled grimly. Commander Qasim Zarqawi. She recognized the voice from the intelligence briefings. He was the architect of this ambush, a former military officer who had built his reputation on night operations and unconventional tactics. He understood what was happening because he would have done the same thing in her position. The difference was that Zarqawi had learned to hunt in wars. Ren had learned from something far older and more patient. She had learned from the darkness itself. She checked the time. 4 hours until dawn. 3 hunters eliminated. 2 remained somewhere in the valley, plus the forces holding the ridge and the compound. The odds were still overwhelmingly against her team, but the equation was shifting. Every enemy she removed was pressure release from her pinned teammates. Every hunter she silenced was another few minutes of survival. The 4th target was on the ridge. She had spotted his position earlier, a heavy weapons emplacement that commanded the entire valley floor. Taking it out would be difficult. The approach was exposed, and the enemy would be alert now, watching for exactly the kind of threat she represented. Difficult, not impossible. Ren oriented herself toward the eastern ridge and began to climb. The eastern ridge rose above the valley like a wall of black stone, its face scarred by centuries of wind and weather into a maze of cracks and ledges that most climbers would consider impassable in daylight. In darkness, it was something else entirely. A challenge that required absolute trust in hands and feet, in the memory of muscles trained to find purchase where none seemed to exist. Ren climbed without rope or safety equipment, her fingers finding holds that her eyes could barely see. The rock was cold beneath her palms, rough enough to grip, but smooth enough to punish any mistake with a fatal slide into the void below. She moved slowly, deliberately, testing each hold before committing her weight. A fall from this height would kill her. A fall from half this height would kill her. There was no margin for error. Below and behind her, the valley floor flickered with occasional muzzle flashes as the remaining enemy forces exchanged fire with their pinned teammates. The shooting was sporadic now, probing rather than sustained. Zarqawi was conserving ammunition and waiting for dawn when his superior numbers would become an insurmountable advantage. He believed time was on his side. He was wrong. Ren reached a narrow ledge 2/3 of the way up the ridge face and paused to catch her breath. Her arms burned with exertion and her fingers were scraped raw from the climb, but she was close now. The heavy weapon's position was somewhere above her, its exact location marked in her memory by the muzzle flash she had observed earlier. 30 meters, maybe less. The captured radio crackled in her ear. All units report status. Team 1 has returned to compound. Team 4 confirms no visual contact with the enemy. Ridge position secure. Ridge position secure. The words almost made her laugh. The man on that ridge had no idea that death was climbing toward him through the darkness, patient and silent and utterly certain of its purpose. She resumed her climb. Back at the low wall, Okonkwo pressed his back against the stone and tried to make sense of what was happening. The enemy fire had slackened noticeably in the past hour, and twice he had seen movement on the southern slopes that suggested hostile forces were repositioning rather than pressing their attack. Something had changed. Something had shifted the balance of the engagement in ways he could not fully understand. Voss crouched beside him. His earlier panic hardened into a brittle kind of composure. He had stopped giving contradictory orders and started listening, which was an improvement even if it came too late to matter. "What is she doing out there?" he asked quietly. Okonkwo shook his head. "I do not know exactly. But whatever it is working. He raised his night vision scope and scanned the terrain beyond their position. The enemy movements he could observe were defensive now, pulling back toward consolidated positions rather than pushing forward to finish the trapped Americans. And then he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. A small arrangement of stones near a boulder formation to the south. 3 rocks stacked in a precise pattern that could not be natural. He swept his scope further and found another arrangement near the edge of the boulder field, and another beyond that. She is marking her kills, he whispered. Mother of God, she is hunting them one by one. Voss stared at him. That is impossible. One operator against an entrenched enemy force in unfamiliar terrain at night. No one could do that. Okonkwo lowered his scope and looked at the man who had dismissed Ren as a diversity hire just hours ago. Someone is doing it, he said. And right now, she is the only reason we are still alive. On the ridge, Ren pulled herself over the final lip of rock and lay flat against the cold stone, controlling her breathing while she assessed the terrain ahead. The heavy weapon's position was 20 meters away, a sandbagged emplacement built into a natural depression in the ridgeline. She could see 2 figures manning the position, their attention fixed on the valley below. A third man sat behind them, speaking quietly into a radio. 3 targets, elevated position, limited cover for approach. She considered her options. A direct assault would be costly, even with the element of surprise. The moment she opened fire, the other 2 would react, and at this range reaction time could make the difference between success and failure. She needed to close the distance. She needed to get close enough that speed and violence of action could overwhelm their numerical advantage. She began to crawl. The stones scraped against her body as she moved, cold and unforgiving. She kept her profile flat against the rock, invisible against the darkness to anyone who was not specifically looking for her. 10 meters. The radio operator shifted position and she froze, holding her breath until he settled again. 5 meters. One of the gunners reached for a canteen, and she used the movement to cover another 2 meters of ground. 3 meters. Close enough to smell them. Close enough to hear the words they exchanged in quiet voices about relief shifts and morning prayers and the Americans who would be dead by sunrise. Ren rose from the darkness like something born from nightmare, and she was among them before the first one could scream. The first man died with her knife in his throat before his hand could reach his weapon. The second spun toward the sound of his companion falling and met the butt of her rifle against his temple with a crack that echoed off the surrounding rocks. The third, the radio operator, managed to get his sidearm halfway out of its holster before Ren's blade found him as well. 3 seconds. 3 men. Silence. She stood among the bodies, breathing hard, her pulse pounding in her ears as the adrenaline surge began to fade. The heavy weapon's emplacement was hers now. The machine gun that had been raining death on her teammates sat cold and quiet on its tripod, its barrel still warm from the rounds it had fired earlier. She checked the ammunition supply and found 2 full belts remaining, enough to change the shape of the battle below. But first she had work to do. She arranged her stones beside each of the fallen, 3 small cairns that caught the starlight and held it like offerings to the darkness. Then she moved to the radio and listened to the chatter flowing through the enemy frequency. The confusion she had heard earlier had deepened into something closer to fear. Reports of missing teams. Demands for status updates that went unanswered. And beneath it all, the voice of Commander Zarqawi, growing increasingly sharp as he tried to impose order on a situation that was slipping beyond his control. Ridge position, report status, he demanded. Ridge position, acknowledge. Ren keyed the microphone and said nothing. She simply held the transmit button for 5 seconds, letting the silence speak for itself, and then released it. The enemy frequency exploded with panic chatter. Ridge position is compromised. Someone has taken the ridge. All units fall back to the compound. Fall back immediately. She permitted herself a moment of satisfaction. Fear was a weapon, and she just fired it directly into the heart of the enemy force. They would consolidate now, pulling their scattered elements back to defensible positions. That would buy her team time and reduce the number of threats spread across the valley. But it would also make Zarqawi harder to reach. She turned the heavy machine gun toward the compound and opened fire. The effect was immediate and devastating. Rounds tore through the enemy positions below, scattering fighters who had believed they were safe behind their walls. She walked the fire across the compound in controlled bursts, targeting positions she had identified during the earlier fighting. A vehicle exploded in a fountain of orange flame. A sandbag position collapsed under the sustained fire. Men ran for cover that could not protect them from the angle of her attack. The radio screamed with desperate calls. "We're taking fire from the ridge. Our own position is being used against us." Someone silenced that gun, but there was no one left on the ridge to silence it. There was only Ren, methodically emptying the ammunition belts into the enemy compound while her teammates watched in stunned disbelief from their scattered positions below. At the low wall, Okonkwo stared up at the ridge with something approaching awe. The muzzle flash from the heavy weapons position was clearly visible, but it was pointed in the wrong direction. It was firing into the compound. It was firing at the enemy. "She took the ridge," he breathed. She actually took the ridge. Voss stood beside him, his face pale in the reflected light of the burning vehicle below. "That is not possible," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. Everything he had believed about what was possible had been destroyed in the past few hours. The machine gun fell silent when the ammunition was exhausted, and the night seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath. Smoke rose from the compound in thick columns, and the enemy fire that had pinned the American team for hours had gone completely quiet. Ren surveyed the destruction she had caused and calculated her next move. The fifth hunter was still out there somewhere. She had tracked 4 of the 5 original hunting teams and eliminated them all, but one remained unaccounted for. The radio traffic suggested he had been recalled to the compound, which meant he was now behind walls that were still standing despite her assault. And Zarqawi was in there with him. The commander who had planned this ambush, who had nearly destroyed her entire team, who had underestimated her just as thoroughly as Holloway and Voss had done. She checked her remaining ammunition. 2 magazines for her rifle. Her knife. A single grenade she had recovered from one of the fallen hunters. Not enough for a direct assault on a fortified compound, even one that had been softened by her attack. She would need to be creative. Ren descended from the ridge using a different route than the one she had climbed, moving toward the compound through terrain that the enemy would not expect anyone to traverse. The darkness wrapped around her like a cloak, familiar and welcoming. 3 hours until dawn. 3 hours to finish what she had started. The hunt was not over yet. The compound walls had been built to withstand assault from the valley floor. Thick stone reinforced with sandbags and wire that would slow any conventional attack long enough for the defenders to cut the attackers apart. But walls had weaknesses. Every fortification ever built had blind spots, approaches that the designers considered impassable and therefore left unguarded. Ren had spent her career finding those blind spots and exploiting them. She circled the compound from the west, moving through a dry stream bed that offered concealment and a gradual approach to the rear wall. The enemy would be watching the front, watching the ridge, watching all the directions from which a conventional threat might come. They would not be watching a drainage culvert that disappeared beneath their own fortifications. The culvert was narrow and dark and smelled of stagnant water and things that had died in the shadows. Ren crawled through it on her belly, her rifle held ahead of her, her elbows scraping against rough concrete that had been poured decades ago and left to crack and crumble in the years since. The darkness here was absolute, so complete that even her trained eyes could distinguish nothing. She navigated by touch and sound, counting meters in her head, building a map of her progress through pure spatial awareness. Halfway through the culvert, she heard voices above her, men speaking in urgent tones about the disaster that had befallen them. She froze and listened, translating fragments of conversation that painted a picture of an enemy in disarray. Half their force was dead or missing. The ridge position that had been their greatest advantage was now a liability, a reminder of how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. And somewhere in the darkness, Something was hunting them that they could not see or understand. One voice cut through the others with commanding authority. Zarqawi. He was rallying his remaining fighters, promising them that dawn would bring reinforcements and air support, that they only needed to hold until sunrise. His words carried conviction, but Rin could hear the strain beneath them. He was afraid. He had built his reputation on controlling the night, and now someone had taken that control away from him. She continued through the culvert until she reached a rusted grate that blocked the exit into the compound interior. The metal was old and corroded, weakened by years of neglect. She tested it carefully, feeling for the points of greatest weakness, and then applied pressure with controlled force. The grate gave way with a groan that seemed deafening in the enclosed space, and Rin held her breath, waiting for a response. None came. The sounds of activity in the compound continued undisturbed. She was inside. She emerged into a storage area cluttered with crates and equipment, the remnants of whatever operation this compound had supported before tonight. Dim light filtered through gaps in the walls, enough to navigate by, but not enough to reveal her presence to anyone who was not specifically looking. She moved through the shadows, cataloging the layout, identifying the positions of the remaining defenders. The enemy radio provided constant intelligence. Zarqawi had consolidated his fighters into 3 positions. A group at the main gate watching the approach from the valley. A group on the roof providing overwatch. And a command element in the central building where Zarqawi himself was coordinating the defense. The 5th hunter was with the roof group. She recognized his voice from the earlier radio traffic, the only surviving member of the teams that had been sent to finish off the scattered Americans. He was describing what he had seen in the darkness, the stone markers beside his fallen comrades, the impossible silence of an enemy who moved like smoke through the mountains. His words carried the tremor of a man who had looked into the abyss and seen something looking back. Rin smiled grimly. Good. Let them fear the darkness. Let them jump at shadows and doubt their own senses. Fear would make them careless, and carelessness would get them killed. She mapped her approach to the roof access point, a ladder fixed to the exterior wall that would take her directly to the 5th hunter and the Overwatch team. 3 targets, elevated position, limited cover once she committed to the climb. But she had done this before. Hours ago, she had scaled a cliff face in total darkness to reach the ridge position. A simple ladder was nothing compared to that. She keyed her radio one final time. Okonkwo, this is Castellanos. I am inside the compound. Prepare to move on my signal. When you see the roof position go dark, push forward and secure the main gate. Castellanos, you are insane, came the whispered reply, but it carried something that sounded almost like admiration. Understood. We'll be ready. Rin checked her remaining ammunition one more time. 2 magazines, 1 knife, 1 grenade. Limited resources for what she was about to attempt. But she had never needed much. The darkness had always been enough. She began to climb. The ladder was cold beneath her hands, each rung slick with condensation from the night air. Rin climbed in silence, her body pressed close to the metal to minimize her profile against the wall. Above her, the roof edge was a dark line against the stars. And somewhere beyond that line, 3 men waited with weapons ready, watching for threats they believed would come from the valley below. She paused 2 rungs from the top and listened. Footsteps on gravel, the click of a rifle safety being checked. Quiet conversation between men who were trying to convince themselves that the worst was over. She identified positions by sound alone. 2 near the front of the roof, overlooking the main approach. 1 further back, pacing in a nervous pattern that suggested he could not stand still. The pacer was the 5th hunter. She recognized the rhythm of his movement, the way fear had infected his body and turned it into something that could not find rest. He had seen what she had done to his comrades. He had walked among the stone markers and understood that something had come for them in the darkness, something that did not miss and did not stop. Now he waited for it to come for him. She would not make him wait much longer. Rin pulled herself over the roof edge in a single fluid motion, staying low, letting the darkness swallow her silhouette before any of the 3 men could register movement. The two at the front remained fixed on the valley, their attention locked on the killing ground where their ambush had gone so terribly wrong. The pacer had his back to her, walking toward the far edge of the roof. She crossed the distance to the first man in 4 silent steps. Her knife found him before he could turn, and she lowered his body to the gravel with the care of someone handling something precious. The second man heard nothing. He continued staring out at the darkness, unaware that the darkness had already arrived behind him. He fell beside his companion without a sound. The fifth hunter turned at the wrong moment. Some instinct, some primal warning that had kept humanity alive through millennia of nights filled with predators, made him spin toward the spot where his comrades had stood. He saw their bodies on the gravel. He saw the shadow standing over them, and he saw the starlight catch the edge of a blade that was already in motion. He tried to raise his rifle. He tried to scream a warning. He managed neither. Ren stood over the last of the hunters and allowed herself a moment to breathe. 5 hunters sent into the darkness to finish off her scattered team. 5 hunters now lying silent across the mountainside and the compound, their deaths marked by small cairns of stone that no one else would understand. The hunt was complete, but the mission was not finished. She arranged her stones beside the fallen and then moved to the roof edge overlooking the compound interior. The central building was directly below, its windows dark but its door guarded by 2 men with automatic weapons. Zarqawi was in there. The architect of this night's horrors was hiding behind walls and guards, waiting for a dawn that would never save him. Ren keyed her radio. Okonkwo, roof position is dark. Move now. She heard the response in the distance before she heard it through her earpiece. Gunfire erupted at the main gate as Okonkwo led the survivors of her team in a coordinated push. The guards at the gate spun toward the new threat, their attention pulled away from the compound interior. The 2 men guarding the central building rushed toward the sound of battle, leaving their post undefended. Ren dropped from the roof. She landed in a roll that absorbed the impact and brought her up into a crouch with her rifle ready. The central building was 10 meters away. Its door hung open where the guards had abandoned their post. Inside, she could hear Zarqawi shouting orders into a radio that no one was left to answer. She moved through the door like a whisper, her weapon up, her senses extended to their limits. The interior was a maze of corridors and small rooms, most of them empty, all of them dark. She navigated by sound, following the voice of the commander who had tried to destroy her team. The final room was at the end of the corridor. Light spilled from beneath the door, the glow of lanterns or battery-powered lamps. Zarqawi's voice was clear now, desperate, demanding reinforcements that would not arrive in time. Ren kicked the door open and stepped through. Zarqawi spun from his radio console, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. He was smaller than she had expected, lean and weathered, with eyes that burned with an intelligence that had orchestrated countless operations like the one tonight. He had built his legend on darkness and fear, on controlling the night and using it as a weapon against his enemies. Now he faced someone who had taken that weapon away from him. "You," he breathed. "You are the one." Ren did not respond. She simply raised her rifle and centered it on his chest. Zarqawi's hand hovered over his pistol. He could see death in her eyes, could read the certainty of his end in the steadiness of her aim. But he was not ready to surrender. "Not yet. You cannot understand what you have done tonight," he said. "The forces I answer to will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Ren's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then they will learn what you learned," she said quietly. "The darkness does not belong to you." Zarqawi moved faster than she expected. His hand closed on his pistol and brought it up in a motion that spoke of decades of training, and Ren was forced to adjust her aim as he dove behind an overturned table. Her first shot splintered wood where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Her second punched through the table, but missed the man sheltering behind it. He returned fire blindly, rounds snapping past her head as she rolled behind a concrete pillar. The room erupted in chaos, muzzle flashes strobing in the confined space, the sound of gunfire deafening in the enclosed walls. Zarqawi was shouting something she could not understand, words that might have been curses or prayers or both. Ren controlled her breathing and assessed the situation. She had one magazine remaining after the shots she had already fired. Zarqawi had unknown ammunition but limited cover. The table would not stop sustained fire. She needed to end this quickly before the noise drew reinforcements from the fighting at the gate. She pulled the grenade from her vest and considered her options. The room was too small for a safe throw. The blast radius would catch her as surely as it would catch Zarqawi. But the grenade was not just a weapon. It was a tool. She pulled the pin and let the spoon fly free, counting in her head. 1, 2. She rolled the grenade across the floor toward the overturned table, not to kill, but to force movement. Zarqawi saw it coming. He had no choice but to abandon his cover, throwing himself toward the doorway at the back of the room as the grenade skittered past his former position. The explosion shattered the table and filled the air with smoke and debris, but Ren was already moving, anticipating his escape route, cutting off his retreat. They collided in the doorway. Zarqawi's pistol came up, and she knocked it aside with her forearm, the shot going wide and punching through the ceiling. Her rifle was too long for this distance. She let it fall on its sling and drew her knife, the blade that had already claimed so many lives tonight. Zarqawi produced his own knife from somewhere, a curved blade that gleamed in the flickering light of the damaged room. He was skilled. She could see it in his stance, in the way he held the weapon, in the calm that had replaced his earlier desperation. He had been a soldier before he became a commander. He knew how to fight. So did she. They circled each other in the narrow corridor, each looking for an opening. Zarqawi feinted left and slashed right, a combination that would have opened her throat if she had not read it in his shoulders before his arm began to move. She deflected the blade and countered with a thrust that he barely avoided, the tip of her knife tracing a line across his ribs that drew blood but did not stop him. "You are good," he admitted through gritted teeth. "Better than I expected. But you are tired. You have been fighting all night. I can see it in your movements." Ren did not waste breath on a response. He was right. She was tired. The hours of hunting through the darkness, the climb up the ridge, the relentless violence of the night had drained reserve she could not replenish. But tired was not the same as defeated. Her father had taught her that in the swamps, pushing her beyond exhaustion until she learned that the body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. Zarqawi attacked again, a flurry of slashes designed to overwhelm her defenses through sheer aggression. She gave ground, backing down the corridor, letting him extend himself. He was faster than her now, fresher, riding the adrenaline of a man fighting for his life. But speed without control was just movement, and movement could be predicted. She saw the pattern in his third combination. A high slash followed by a low thrust followed by a step to her left that would put her against the wall. He was hurting her, controlling the space, using the corridor to limit her options. She let him think it was working. The high slash came, and she ducked beneath it. The low thrust came, and she sidestepped, feeling the blade whisper past her hip. He stepped left to pin her against the wall, and found empty air instead, his momentum carrying him forward into space she had already vacated. Ren stepped behind him and drove her knife into the base of his skull. Zarqawi stiffened. His blade clattered to the floor. He tried to turn, tried to speak, tried to do something other than die in a dark corridor at the hands of a woman he had dismissed as nothing. But his body no longer answered his commands. He fell. Ren stood over him, breathing hard, her knife still in her hand. The corridor was silent except for the distant sound of gunfire from the gate. She cleaned her blade on his shirt and sheathed it, then retrieved her rifle and checked the remaining ammunition. Half a magazine. Enough to finish whatever remained. She keyed her radio. "Zarqawi is down. Compound command element is neutralized. What is your status?" Okonkwo's voice came back through static and the sound of gunfire. "Gate is secure. Enemy forces are surrendering. We have them, Castellanos. We have them." Ren leaned against the corridor wall and let herself breathe. Outside, the first faint hint of gray was touching the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming. They had survived. She had kept them alive. The sun rose over the mountains in shades of gold and amber, painting the valley in colors that seemed impossible after the darkness that had filled it for so many hours. Rin walked out of the central building and into the light, her rifle hanging at her side, her body moving on autopilot while her mind processed the magnitude of what she had done. The compound was a ruin. Smoke still rose from the vehicle she had destroyed with the capture machine gun. Walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Enemy fighters who had believed this night would end with American blood on their hands. They had been wrong. Okonkwo met her at the gate. His face was streaked with dust and dried blood from the gash above his eye. But his expression carried something she had rarely seen directed at her. Respect. Genuine, unqualified respect. "Castellanos," he said, and then stopped. Words seemed inadequate for what he wanted to express. He simply extended his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and warm, and it communicated everything his voice could not. They stood like that for a moment, two soldiers who had survived something that should have killed them, connected by the simple act of acknowledgement. The sound of rotors reached them from the east. Extraction helicopters, finally close enough to reach the valley now that dawn had broken. Rin watched them approach and felt something loosen in her chest. A tension she had been carrying since the first explosion had ripped through the night. They were going home. All of them who remained were going home. Voss appeared from somewhere behind the gate, shepherding Petrov and the other wounded toward the landing zone. He saw Rin and stopped, his face cycling through emotions she could not quite read. Shame, confusion, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. He walked toward her slowly, each step seeming to cost him something. When he reached her, he stood in silence for a long moment, unable to meet her eyes. "I was wrong," he said finally. The words came out rough, forced through a throat that did not want to release them. "About you. About everything. I was wrong." Rin studied him. She could have said many things. She could have reminded him of every insult, every dismissal, every moment when his contempt had made her feel like less than nothing. But she had spent the night killing men. She had no desire to wound one more. "Yes," she said simply. "You were." She walked past him toward the helicopters without looking back. The extraction was chaos organized into something resembling order. Medics rushed to treat the wounded while pilots kept their rotors spinning, ready for immediate departure. Rin helped load Petrov onto a stretcher, the communications specialist gripping her hand with surprising strength. "You saved my life," Petrov said. "Those hunters would have found me if you had not stopped them." Rin shook her head. "We saved each other. That is what teams do." But even as she said it, she knew it was not entirely true. The team had not saved her. The team had dismissed her and ignored her and relegated her to a position where she could contribute nothing. She had saved herself the same way she had saved all of them, by being exactly who she was regardless of what anyone else believed. The helicopters lifted off as the sun climbed higher, carrying the survivors away from the valley that had nearly become their grave. Rin sat with her back against the vibrating metal wall, her eyes closed, her body finally beginning to acknowledge the exhaustion she had been holding at bay. Around her, the other operators sat in shell-shocked silence, processing a night that had rewritten everything they thought they knew. Okonkwo settled beside her. He did not speak for a long time, letting the rotor noise fill the space between them. Finally, he leaned close enough to be heard. "What you did out there," he said. "I have never seen anything like it. No one has ever seen anything like it. How did you learn to move like that? To hunt like that?" Rin opened her eyes and looked at him. For a moment, she was 7 years old again, standing in the darkness of the Everglades with her father's hand on her shoulder. "Listen, Mija. The darkness is speaking. Can you hear what it says?" "My father taught me," she said. "He taught me that the darkness is not something to fear. It is something to understand, something to become." Okonkwo nodded slowly. He did not ask more questions. Some things could not be explained with words. They could only be witnessed. The helicopters flew east toward the rising sun, leaving the valley and its dead behind. Rin watched the mountains recede through the open door, their shadows shrinking as the light grew stronger. The night was over, but the legend of what had happened in that darkness was just beginning to spread. The forward operating base erupted into controlled chaos when the helicopters touched down. Medical teams rushed to receive the wounded while intelligence officers waited with recorders and notepads, hungry for debriefings that would explain how an ambush that should have been a massacre had turned into something else entirely. Rin stepped off the helicopter and into a world that had changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. Captain Marcus Thorne was waiting on the tarmac. He was a tall man with silver at his temples and eyes that had seen enough combat to recognize its aftermath in the faces of those who survived it. He watched Rin approach with an expression she could not quite read. "Lieutenant Castellanos," he said, "walk with me." They moved away from the chaos of the landing zone toward a quiet corner of the base where the noise faded into background murmur. Thorne stopped and turned to face her, his hands clasped behind his back. "I received reports throughout the night," he said. "Fragmentary transmissions. Confused accounts. Men describing things they could barely believe they were witnessing." He paused. "They said one of our operators went into the darkness alone and systematically dismantled an entrenched enemy force. They said she moved like a ghost. They said she hunted them." Rin met his gaze without flinching. "I did what was necessary to keep my team alive, sir." Thorne nodded slowly. "Lieutenant Commander Al-Rashid requested you specifically for this mission. He said you were the finest night operations specialist he had ever encountered. He said your classified record contained things that would make experienced operators question their own abilities." He studied her face. "I believe I understand now why he was so insistent." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "New orders," he said. "Effective immediately. There are people who want to meet you, Castellanos. People who have been looking for someone with your particular talents for a very long time." Rin took the paper, but did not open it. She knew what it meant. More missions. Harder targets. Deeper darkness than anything she had faced before. The night she had just survived was not an ending. It was an audition. "Before I go," she said, "I need to see Holloway." Thorne's expression flickered. "Master Chief Holloway is in surgery. The prognosis is uncertain." "I know," Rin said. "I still need to see him." She found him in the medical wing an hour later, after the surgeons had done what they could and left him to rest in a drug-induced sleep. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the tubes and monitors that surrounded his bed. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, stripped away by bullets and blood loss, and the simple reality of how close he had come to death. Rin stood beside his bed and watched him breathe. She did not hate him. She had never hated any of them, not really. Hate required energy she had always preferred to spend on other things. But she had wanted him to see. She had wanted all of them to see what she was capable of when given the chance. Holloway's eyes opened. They were cloudy with medication, but aware enough to recognize who stood beside him. He stared at her for a long moment, his cracked lips moving soundlessly. "You," he managed finally. "You saved them." Rin nodded. "Yes. I would not listen." His voice was barely a whisper. "You tried to warn us, and I would not listen. Because I thought I knew what you were. I thought I knew what you could not do." "You were wrong," Rin said. It was not an accusation. It was simply truth. Holloway closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet with something that might have been tears, or might have been the drugs, or might have been the weight of everything he had believed crumbling under the evidence of what she had done. "I'm sorry," he said. Rin reached down and touched his hand briefly. Then she turned and walked out of the medical wing without looking back. The transport was waiting for her on the far side of the base, its engines already warming for departure to destinations she had not yet been told. She carried a single bag over her shoulder, everything she needed for whatever came next. The sun was high now, burning away the last shadows of the night that had changed everything. A young woman in naval uniform stood near the transport ramp, watching Rin approach with wide eyes. She was new, fresh from training, her insignia marking her as a candidate for programs that most people did not know existed. "Excuse me," she said as Rin drew close. "Are you Lieutenant Castellanos? Are you the one they call Noctua?" Rin paused. The call sign had spread faster than she expected. "One hunts in the dark." The words that had been whispered over the radio as she moved through the mountains, a warning from those who had seen what she could do to those who had not yet learned to fear. "I am," she said. The young woman straightened. "I want to be like you someday." I want to learn to do what you do. Rin studied her for a moment, seeing echoes of herself years ago, hungry and determined and unaware of the cost that came with the gift she sought. She thought of her father, of the nights in the swamps, of the lessons that had shaped her into something most people could not understand. The darkness is not a weapon, she said finally. It is a teacher. If you want to learn from it, you have to be willing to let it change you. She walked up the ramp and into the transport without waiting for a response. The engines roared. The aircraft lifted into the sky. And somewhere below, a legend continued to grow about the woman who hunted in the dark. If this story moved you, drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment or character. Maybe you have known someone whose hidden abilities surprised everyone around them. Or perhaps you have been underestimated yourself. We would love to hear your story.